Hey guys, I'm Emily. I'm a film and television student, and this is my Keystone project, Storyboards to Graphic Novel Addressing the Challenges of Transmedial Adaptation. So I come from a background as an artist, and I'm a film student, and it kind of occurred to me a key aspect of my life has been storytelling, and there's significant overlap between those two mediums. And I kind of latched onto the idea of transmedial adaptation, or taking a story that is told in one medium and adapting it to be told in another. So the focus of this project is the answering of the question, what are the best ways to address the inevitable challenges that come from adapting a story from one medium to another, with a specific focus on storyboard to graphic novel adaptation. And I sought to understand the differences between the visual mediums of storyboarding and graphic novels and develop a creative method to bridge the gap between the two. So storyboarding is a pre-production process in which an artist draws cartoon-like schematics of how a film's shots will eventually look. And in some ways, they're similar to comics, though they can usually not be enjoyed in the same way due to their fundamental purpose of being a blueprint. One main difference is the communication of information. Storyboards have text written below or to the side of the images, describing how long the shot should be, the camera movements, maybe some dialogue, and they also include symbols that are designed to help the production process. So now I'd like to introduce you to the subject of my storyboards and my graphic novel. I wrote this screenplay. It's called Between the Moon and the Milkman, and it follows the convoluted events of a harvest party in rural mid-century Vermont. The protagonist is Eileen Donovan, an acclaimed private detective. So what is supposed to be a joyous occasion turns grim when Ernie Aguila, the dairy farmer next door, is found dead in the orchard. So storyboarding is the first step in the process. This portion of my project followed a developed protocol that adheres to a set of standard symbols and methods. I first made thumbnail storyboards, or quick rough sketches of each shot. As I drew, I added another layer on top of that of symbols such as arrows and panels to communicate character and camera movement. And lastly, I wrote under each shot what the audience sees and hears and how long the shot should last. Some examples of that. Here's one example. This, for some context, takes place early in the film. It's set about 10 years before the majority of the story, and it shows significant events happening to younger versions of the main characters. These are all static shots. As you can see, there's no camera movement. What we do have is these blue arrows to show character or object movement, such as like the hand moving towards the radio, and on that bottom middle slide, a car tracking shot moving through a road at night. These shots represent a total of 11 seconds of the film. You can see like there's seconds marked, but it's been up on the screen for longer than 11 seconds, and as you can probably tell, it's pretty hard to read. Simply reading the words underneath each panel will take at least like double the intended length of the shot, so trying to like mentally picture each shot, including the sound effects and everything, would take even longer. It's just really difficult to consume. This is another example of one of my storyboards. This takes place about 40 pages later than that original storyboard. Clearly, immediately, this is visually overwhelming. It just doesn't really work as a readable comic. I've had to invent some symbols on the upper panels, dotted lines to show that like a person is fading away, like their opacity is changing, which there's no established symbol for that. And I've written in fade away just because I've had to kind of make do. The next portion of my project was turning this into a graphic novel, the actual adaptation stage, the translation of the story to a graphic novel form. And in this stage, I have added and am continuing to add dialogue and other formatting details and am troubleshooting. So, for example, character movements are a whole thing, including the dialogue. In film, camera movements manipulate the audience in a good way to feel a certain way, to instill a sense of like drama or pacing. And comics do this through formatting. The size of panels can fluctuate, the proximity of panels to one another, the orientation of the page, etc. All of it can kind of create the illusion of mood and as well as time. So here's an example of one of my transmedial adaptations. As you can see, this like tiny image over here is the original storyboard. And there's some differences. So the layout, the size of panels. In the storyboard, I have the ability to write and tell the audience how much time they should be spending viewing this shot, like 4 seconds. I cannot do that in the form of graphic novels, and instead I've used the scale of the frames to imply temporal sequence. I don't have the ability to include sound effects, so I kind of included in that first box up there a little like the straight line goes to like a rumble to kind of communicate, imply that the car is moving on a country road. The inclusion of music notes, an exclamation point in storyboarding, you only include what you can actually see in the shot, and because even though the character may be surprised, you're not seeing an exclamation point, you can't include that in a storyboard, really. And instead of the arrow to show the car moving, I've kind of like manipulated the edge of that scene to kind of show like a violent car moving quickly, showing pace. This is another example of that second storyboard I showed earlier. Here, I purposely break the panel to show that the character that was moving through the scene, since I chose not to include arrows to symbolize movement, I put her on top of the panel, and Ernie, the character to the left, behind the panel in the background, to show that distance. I wasn't super a fan of the dotted lines that I had to use in my storyboard, so instead I chose to include multiple versions of the characters that were fading into the distance before in different values. Yeah. So the conclusion of this adaptation section, I will be producing hard zine copies of my story, told both through storyboard and graphic novel. And the purpose of this concretization of my story is not only to have an easily distributable copy that is typical to its medium, but also to glean opinions from readers. Making these distributables will allow me to see how others view my work and whether it registered and whether it, when translated into storyboard and then comic. I'd really like to know whether this method would be beneficial to people, whether they'd actually be interested in consuming graphic novels from storyboards. And the gleaning process is something that I have not yet been able to do, but it is something I plan on doing in the future at the conclusion of the graphic novel process. So some challenges. Something I really struggled with was time management. Like I mentioned, fall semester was pretty busy for me, and it was really difficult to set aside that time and just work on a project that was going to be due in 6 months when I had homework due tomorrow. Of course, this would kind of lead me into a vicious cycle of procrastinating and stressing out over and over. However, the adaptation process actually takes so much less time, minutes as opposed to hours, than drawing the storyboards. Just translating them into a graphic novel was quick because I kind of already knew what I wanted to communicate. It was just a matter of arrangement. The tedious process of drawing a billion pictures, not actually a billion, but each of those little blips is one keyframe of my Adobe Animate project, and each of those keyframes has 6 drawings. So in total, I drew 1,466 pictures, and sometimes I would draw for hours and then check how much screenplay I had covered, and it'd be half a page, and I'd be like, why, what's the point? Why am I doing this? So that was very discouraging to see, but I think it all paid off from the sense of accomplishment and excitement at the next step. So the significance and conclusion here, this project is really important to me personally because I see potential for storytelling in storyboards. The visuals are present, the dialogue is there, and yet it's not really an easily consumable medium for audiences. And I think that this gap could easily be bridged between design tool and narrative art, and that pre-production art teams could easily publish their work as a graphic novel in addition to a film. I think that such transmedial adaptations would be a popular, potentially profitable, untapped medium if created from well-loved film storyboards. And my project would be a pseudo-formula for how pre-production artists might go about creating this. But despite the industry potential behind this, I think the most significant effect this exploration could have, if successful, is that narratives could be enjoyed in a new way. And that's my presentation. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Questions?
So, I'm also an artist, so this is cool. Now, when you do a storyboard, oftentimes people who are doing storyboards are keeping in screen language in mind that's designed for film.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any, besides camera movement, are there any elements of screen language that don't translate well to the graphic novel format? So when you're translating it over, let's say you're a storyboard artist and you're publishing as a graphic novel, how do you account for things that don't translate well, regardless of note-taking, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that's something that is kind of huge. I encountered the camera movements, the character movements were super hard to translate, but both mediums have that already. It's just kind of a matter of where I've written SFX, there's crickets chirping. I have to somehow communicate that. It's just a matter of what is the best way, and best is so subjective, but most easily consumable and looks attractive. yeah, it's just like a matter of like how would someone prefer to view this versus in storyboarding, it's like how like the utilization of it. Yeah.
That was a really cool presentation. Can you talk a little bit more about the symbols that you created and maybe some symbols that you phased out and how they changed over time when you were figuring out how to put it into this graphic novel medium?
Yeah. So one that I did touch on was like the blue arrows and the dotted lines to show like fading away. There's also like the zoom out shots. I didn't get a chance to cover this one, but there's like these zooming out shots to show like slow drama, imply like gravitas, but you can't really do that in comics because you'd be reading that and you wouldn't make your mind zoom it out. Like you wouldn't do that. So you have to somehow communicate that in another way. I chose to instead kind of like create the drama by repetition and like kind of breaking up the layout of the page just as like to attract attention because I think the more like attention you can it's the matter of like pacing, I guess. Like you can't make someone stare at a box for a long time, but you can like help them do it, I guess. Yeah, so that's another symbol.
Yeah, really cool presentation. I'm wondering, you mentioned, the idea of potentially a movie could be released as well as a graphic novel based on this.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, in your opinion, what does that look like? How would that release go in terms of the movie and the novel coming out at once or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's super exciting, like an exciting idea that I hope happens someday. I don't think every movie, like live action movie in the industry has a storyboard, but definitely like a lot of popular movies do. And I think there's so much potential. Like if the movie was released and it's popular, there will be existing storyboards, like it's likely. And I think there's already a pre-production artist team on staff that could do this relatively quickly and output the comic book version of like your next blockbuster. And I don't think it would be too time consuming just from my experience. Yeah.
We're out of time. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you guys.